In the neon-soaked shadows of Seoul, secrets don't just kill, they enslave. Nancy Zola was the invisible ghost in the halls of power, a maid who knew exactly where every body was buried, but she never expected to become one of them. Sold, traded, forced into a wedding where the vows are written in blood, Nancy was handed over to a man whose touch is a death sentence. But while the Mafia Boss thinks he finally owns her, someone else is watching from the darkness. Agent Park Sung-min was sent to dismantle an empire, but he found an obsession he can't arrest. He watched her wedding night through a lens, he watched her bleed, he watched her break, and now he's tired of watching. Tonight the law dies and the obsession takes over. The air inside Kang Jae-hoon's sprawling Seoul estate didn't smell of home. It smelled of expensive floor wax, cold marble, and the metallic tang of suppressed fear. For Nancy Zola, the golden cage was more than a metaphor. It was a high-ceilinged reality where every shadow held a camera and every gilded door was a silent reminder of her status. As the chief maid, she was the invisible heartbeat of the house, moving with a practiced, silent grace that allowed her to blend into the velvet wallpaper while her eyes captured everything. Kang Jae-hoon, the influential and ruthless boss of the empire, ruled this domain with a quiet, terrifying gravity. From her position at the periphery of the grand dining hall, Nancy watched him navigate the dark waters of the underworld. She saw the way politicians bowed just a little too low, and how rival capos gripped their glasses until their knuckles turned white. She was the one who poured their vintage wine, her dark skin a striking contrast against the white lace of her uniform, a black diamond, positioned specifically to signal Jae-hoon's exotic reach and absolute power. But Nancy was no mere servant. She was a collector of hushed whispers and discarded ledgers. She knew which drawer held the burner phones and which floorboards groaned under the weight of secrets that could topple a ministry. Despite the luxury that surrounded her, the designer silks she ironed and the gourmet meals she served, she felt the walls closing in. Her impulsive nature, that internal fire that had once fueled her days as a dancer in the city's neon-lit clubs, was now a liability she had to choke down every morning. She played the part of the obedient ghost, but her mind was always plotting the exit. She didn't yet realize that while she was watching the mafia, someone from the world of light was watching her. From a nondescript van parked blocks away, Agent Park Sung-min was already filtering through the digital noise of the estate, his focus narrowing past the bosses and the bodyguards until it landed, with a disturbing intensity, on the woman adjusting the silver settings at the head of the table. In the golden cage, Nancy thought she was the only one looking out, unaware that the bars were about to be reinforced by a treaty written in her own blood. The air inside the Kang Estate Gala was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, vintage champagne, and the suffocating musk of old money built on new corpses. Nancy Zola moved through the crowd like a shadow in silk, her maid's uniform a stark contrast to the glittering gowns of the elite. She was trained to be invisible, a ghost who refilled crystal flutes and emptied ashtrays without ever making eye contact. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different, heavy, as if a storm were brewing beneath the polished marble floors. As she maneuvered through the sea of high-profile government officials and underworld kings, she felt a sudden, sharp prickle at the back of her neck. It was the sensation of being hunted. Nancy turned, her tray balanced with practiced ease, and that's when she saw him. Standing near the balcony, away from the boisterous laughter of the mobsters, was a man who looked like he was carved from granite. Park Sung-min didn't belong here. While the others wore their power like a loud, gaudy accessory, his authority was quiet, lethal, and clinical. He was a predator in a tailor-made suit. In a rare moment of impulsivity, Nancy's focus wavered. A passing guest jostled her arm, and a splash of deep crimson wine leaped from a glass, staining the pristine white sleeve of Sung-min's shirt. The world seemed to stutter to a halt. Nancy froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked up, expecting the usual flash of anger or a dismissive sneer from a man of his stature. Instead, she was met with a gaze so cold it felt like a physical weight. Sungmin didn't flinch. He didn't look at the stain. His eyes locked onto hers with a terrifying, singular focus. In that electric silence, Nancy didn't see a guest. She saw a man who looked through her skin and into the secrets she kept buried in her soul. For the first time in her life, Nancy felt truly seen, not as a servant but as a person. Sungmin's eyes traced the frantic pulse in her throat, his pupils dilating with a dark, unreadable intensity. It wasn't a look of romance. It was a look of recognition, the kind a collector gives a rare, broken masterpiece. Nancy felt a shiver of pure, unadulterated dread. Before she could stammer an apology, the ruthless Kang Jae-hoon appeared, placing a heavy, possessive hand on her shoulder. The spell was broken, but the damage was done. As Nancy was led away to attend to her master, she felt Sungmin's eyes remaining on her, a cold, invisible tether that told her one terrifying truth. Her life as an invisible ghost was over. The obsession had officially begun. The air in Kang Jae-hoon's private study was thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Nancy stood by the mahogany sideboard, her fingers trembling as she polished a crystal decanter she had already cleaned twice. She was the invisible ghost, the black maid who knew where the bodies were buried, but tonight she felt like the one being lowered into the earth. Across the room, Kang Jae-hoon sat with the predatory grace of a man who owned the city, his gold watch catching the dim light as he gestured toward the man sitting opposite him. Shin Teo was a jagged contrast, older, scarred, and radiating a cold, violent energy that made the hair on Nancy's neck stand up. "The ports in Incheon are becoming a problem, Jae-hoon," Shin Teo rasped, his eyes never leaving Nancy as she moved to pour their drinks. "I need more than a verbal agreement to move my shipments through your territory. I need a blood tie, a guarantee." Jae-hoon leaned back, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. He didn't look at his ledger, he looked at Nancy. "Guarantees are expensive, T.O., but I believe I have something or someone who can bridge that gap. She's more than a maid. She's my finest asset. She knows my secrets. Which means she is now your security." The crystal stopper slipped from Nancy's hand, clattering against the silver tray with a deafening ring. The room went silent. She looked at Jae-hoon, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp betrayal. She wasn't being fired. She was being traded like a commodity to settle a debt between two empires. "You can't," she whispered, her voice cracking the professional mask she had worn for years. Shin Teo rose from his chair, his presence looming over her like a shadow. He reached out his hand, adorned with a heavy championship ring, gripping her jaw with a possessiveness that bruised. He leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear, mirroring the terrifying intimacy of a predator claiming its prey. "From this moment you don't belong to the House of Kang," he hissed, his thumb dragging across her bottom lip. "You belong to me. We signed the treaty in the morning. You'll be wearing my ring by nightfall." Nancy looked toward the window, the rain-slicked streets of Seoul blurred by the tears she refused to let fall. She didn't see the police cruiser idling 3 floors below, nor did she know that Agent Park Sung-min was watching the thermal feed of this very room, his knuckles white as he watched her world collapse. The blood treaty was signed, and Nancy Zola had just been handed a life sentence. The blue glow of the monitors was the only light in Park Sung-min's private sanctuary, a high-tech tomb buried within the walls of the KNPA. On the center screen, the image was grainy but unmistakable. Nancy Zola, no longer the vibrant woman who had spilled wine in defiance at the gala, but a ghost drifting through the cold, marble halls of Shin Teo's estate. Sung-min adjusted his headset, the static hissing in his ears like a serpent. He was supposed to be hunting a syndicate. Instead, he was hunting the rhythm of her breath. He watched as she straightened a duvet, her movements mechanical and hollow. His fingers traced the outline of her face on the glass, a touch she would never feel from a man she didn't know was there. This was his duty, to dismantle the empire from the inside, but the mission had become a convenient excuse for his fixation. He had planted the bugs himself, hidden in the molding of her bedroom and the silk of her vanity. Every clink of a teacup, every heavy sigh she exhaled when she thought she was alone, belonged to him. The door to her room on the monitor swung open, and Shin Teo stepped into the frame. Sungmin's posture stiffened, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of his desk. He watched the way the Mafia Boss loomed over her, a predator claiming his prize, and the way Nancy's shoulders flinched, a micro-expression of terror that only an obsessed observer would catch. Sungmin's heart hammered against his ribs, a violent, rhythmic thud that betrayed his cold exterior. He knew he should be recording the names of the associates Shin mentioned or the locations of the next shipment. Instead, his focus narrowed until the rest of the world blurred into insignificance. He was an agent of the law, sworn to protect and serve, yet he sat in the dark, watching the woman he had failed to save be broken by a monster. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment to strike, but deep down, a darker truth took root. He didn't just want to save her. He wanted to be the only one who saw her, the only one who knew the exact shade of her fear. As the sun began to rise over Seoul, Sungmin didn't blink. The surveillance wasn't a job anymore. It was the only thing keeping him alive. The heavy oak doors of Shin Teo's penthouse suite didn't just close. They sealed like a tomb. Inside, Nancy stood paralyzed, the silk of her wedding gown feeling like cold lead against her skin. She could hear the muffled sound of the city below, a world she no longer belonged to. Across the room, Shin Teo unbuttoned his jacket with the slow, methodical grace of a predator who knew the prey had nowhere to run. He didn't look at her with love or even lust. He looked at her as a trophy won through a blood treaty. Miles away in a darkened surveillance van, the silence was even more suffocating. Park Sungmin sat encased in the blue glow of monitors, his headset pressed so tightly against his ears that the plastic dug into his skin. His breathing was shallow, rhythmic, and dangerous. On his screen, the audio waveform spiked with every rustle of Nancy's dress. He was a man of the law, sworn to protect, yet here he was, a voyeur to a nightmare. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the console, his moral compass spinning wildly toward a dark, magnetic north. He shouldn't be listening for pleasure, yet the sound of her frantic heartbeat, transmitted through a hidden mic in the headboard, was the only thing that made him feel alive. "You're a long way from the maid's quarters now, Nancy." Shin Teo's voice rasped through the speakers, dripping with a terrifying possessiveness. Sungmin flinched at the sound of a sharp slap followed by the heavy thud of Nancy hitting the floor. He heard her gasp, a small, broken sound that echoed in the hollow of his chest. His hand moved instinctively toward the door handle of the van, his body screaming at him to intervene, to break cover, to burn his decade-long investigation for the sake of the girl with the defiant eyes. But he stayed and he listened. He listened as Teo's voice grew lower, more menacing, detailing exactly how he would break her spirit until there was nothing left but a shell. He listened to the sound of silk tearing, a violent, jarring rip that felt like it was happening to his own soul. Tears of pure, helpless rage blurred Sungmin's vision, but he didn't look away from the monitors. This was his penance. This was his obsession. He would record every bruise, every sob, and every insult. He would let the horror of this night tattoo itself onto his brain, until his hatred for the Mafia was indistinguishable from his need for her. As the first night of the forced marriage unfolded in a symphony of terror, Nancy looked up at the ceiling, her eyes vacant and searching for a god that wasn't there. She didn't know that in the darkness, a different kind of monster was listening, one who was falling in love with her pain, and who would eventually burn the whole world down just to claim the ashes. The interrogation room at the KNPA headquarters was a tomb of glass and cold steel, pressurized by a silence that felt like it was crushing the oxygen out of the air. Nancy sat beneath the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights, still wearing the silk evening gown she had been forced into by Shin Teo. The bruise blooming across her cheekbone was a violent violet stain against her skin, a mark of her husband's latest lesson in obedience. The heavy door clicked open. Agent Park Sung-min didn't walk in, he invaded the space. He didn't carry a file or a recorder. He simply leaned against the door frame, his shadow stretching across the table until it touched her trembling hands. For a long moment, he just looked at her, not as a witness, but as a man who had spent every night for months watching her through a digital lens. "You should have stayed in the kitchen, Nancy," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a chill down her spine. "Instead, you're bleeding in my room." Nancy looked up, her wide eyes reflecting the cold blue light of the facility. "You saw it, didn't you? You see everything." Sung-min took a step forward, the distance between them evaporating until she could smell the sterile scent of his cologne. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from her bruised jaw, his hand shaking with a restraint that bordered on agony. "I see the way he touches you. I see the way you look at the knife on the nightstand when he sleeps. I see the fire you're trying so hard to bury." "Then save me," she whispered, a desperate plea breaking through her pride. Sung-min's eyes darkened, the professional mask of the lawman finally cracking to reveal the raw, predatory obsession underneath. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear just as the Mafia Boss had done, but his intent was a different kind of danger. "I can't save you yet, Nancy. If I pull you out now, they kill us both," he hissed, his voice thick with a possessiveness that felt like a brand. He slipped a tiny, microscopic device into her palm, his skin burning against hers. "But I'm not just watching anymore. Keep this on you when you've had enough. When you're ready to kill him, tell me. I'll be the one to clean up the blood." The spark between them wasn't love. It was a mutual descent into madness. Nancy closed her hand around the cold plastic, acknowledging the truth. She wasn't being rescued by an agent. She was being claimed by a ghost. The heavy iron gates of Shin Tio's estate didn't just keep people out. They held the silence of those trapped within. Nancy had spent months memorizing the rotation of the guards, the blind spots of the cameras, and the precise moment the digital locks reset. Tonight, the rain provided the perfect veil. Clinging to the shadows, she moved with the desperate grace of a woman who had nothing left to lose but her soul. She reached the perimeter wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her fingers clawing at the cold stone. For a single heartbeat, the city lights beyond the wire looked like freedom. But freedom was a cruel illusion in a world built on surveillance. Before her feet could touch the pavement on the other side, a blinding spotlight cut through the downpour. The engine of a black sedan roared to life, blocking her path. Nancy froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. From the darkness of the backseat, the window rolled down to reveal Shin Tio's silhouette. He didn't look angry, he looked bored, which was infinitely more terrifying. "Did you think I wouldn't notice my favorite toy missing from its shelf?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating threat. The consequences were not immediate. They began in the windowless basement of the mansion, where the scent of damp concrete and old blood hung heavy in the air. Nancy was forced to her knees, her silk maid's uniform, once a symbol of her status, now tattered and soaked with rainwater. Tio didn't use his hands at first. He used words, dissecting her hope until it felt like a sickness. He reminded her that she was sold, traded, and owned. A commodity with no more rights than the gold watch on his wrist. Then came the physical reckoning. Every strike was calculated to break her spirit without marring the face he enjoyed looking at. He wanted her compliant, not dead. Nancy's screams echoed against the cold walls, but she knew no one was coming. Miles away, in a darkened room filled with monitors, Park Sung-min watched the audio levels on his console spike into the red. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of his desk, the blue light of the screens reflecting the war behind his eyes. He heard every gasp, every plea, and the sickening sound of Nancy's resilience cracking. His job was to observe, to gather intelligence, and to wait. To intervene was to blow a 3-year undercover operation. But as Nancy collapsed onto the concrete floor, her fire finally dampened by the sheer weight of her reality, Sung-min felt something inside him snap. He wasn't just an agent anymore. He was a spectator to a tragedy he was starting to enjoy stopping. Nancy Zola was broken, but in her wreckage, Sung-min's obsession found its final, lethal shape. The blue glow of the surveillance monitors reflected in Park Sung-min's eyes, making them look as cold and clinical as the law he was sworn to uphold. But inside, his pulse was a jagged rhythm of defiance. On the screen, Nancy sat by a window in Shin To's fortress, her silhouette a portrait of elegant despair. She was no longer just a lead in a racketeering case. She had become the only thing that felt real in his world of shadows. Director Park, the forensics on the dockside shooting just came in, his junior officer, Detective Han, said as he entered the darkened room. There's a witness who places a woman matching Zola's description at the scene. If we bring her in now, she'll have to flip on Shin to save herself. Sung-min didn't turn around. His hand tightened on the edge of the desk. If they arrested Nancy now, the Mafia would have her killed before she even reached the interrogation room. He couldn't let her become a sacrificial lamb for a promotion. The witness is unreliable, Han, Sung-min replied, his voice a low, steady lie. He's a known addict looking for a deal. Scrap the statement. We don't move until we have the head of the empire, not the maid. But sir, the protocol. The protocol is whatever I say it is, Sung-min snapped, finally turning with a gaze so predatory it silenced the younger man. Once alone, Sung-min began the delicate task of erasing her. With a few practiced keystrokes, he bypassed the KNPA secure server, deleting the GPS pings that put Nancy near the syndicate's latest drop-off point. He was a man who lived by the book, yet here he was, burning the pages to build a wall around her. He knew the cost of his silence. Every piece of evidence he buried made him more of a criminal than the men he hunted. He watched her on the screen again. She was tracing the scars on her wrist, a silent testament to Shin To's latest fit of rage. Sung-min's jaw ached from clenching. His obsession was no longer a passive observation. It was a slow-acting poison. He wasn't dismantling the empire anymore. He was guarding its most precious prisoner, waiting for the moment he could claim her for himself. The seasons in Seoul didn't change for Nancy. They only bled into a singular, freezing winter. Years passed in the suffocating silence of Shin To's estate, a gilded mausoleum where Nancy Zola learned that survival required a soul of stone. Gone was the impulsive, lively woman who had once danced through the nightclubs of Itaewon. In her place stood a woman with eyes like flint, moving through the halls with the precision of a ghost. She learned to anticipate the heavy tread of her husband's shoes and the specific scent of expensive whiskey that preceded his violence. She no longer begged for mercy or looked for an exit. She simply gathered secrets like shards of glass, tucking them away for the day she would finally be sharp enough to cut back. Across the city, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit halls of the Korean National Police Agency, Park Sung-min was ascending a different kind of throne. The cold, disciplined agent had become a director, a man feared even by his superiors for his ruthless efficiency. But his rise to power was fueled by a dark, private ritual. Every night, behind locked doors, he returned to the surveillance feeds. He watched the graininess of the thermal cameras as Nancy moved through the dark house, a flickering heartbeat in a sea of shadow. He saw the way she began to stand taller even as the bruises deepened, her resilience becoming a challenge to his own self-control. Sung-min became more isolated, his life a hollow shell built around the woman he had let be sold. He despised the mafia empires he was dismantling, yet he realized with a sickening clarity that he was no better than the men he hunted. He didn't want to save her anymore. He wanted to own the strength he saw growing within her. His obsession had matured from a curiosity into a terminal disease. While Nancy hardened her heart against the world that had betrayed her, Sung-min's moral code was quietly eroding. They were two stars collapsing in on themselves, drawing closer in a vacuum of pain and unresolved trauma. She had stopped chasing the ghost of a savior, and he had stopped pretending he was the hero. The Black Maid and the director were no longer the people they were at that first wedding gala. They were now weapons, waiting for the moment they would finally collide and shatter the world that had kept them apart. The silence in the penthouse was never peaceful. It was a predator's breath held in anticipation. Nancy Zola stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection a ghost against the shimmering Seoul skyline. For years, she had survived Shin Tio's volatile temper by becoming a master of shadows. But tonight, the air felt different, thicker, metallic, and heavy with an impending storm. Behind her, the heavy click of a designer lighter signaled his arrival. Shin Tio didn't just walk into a room, he invaded it. He leaned close to Nancy's ear, the scent of expensive scotch and cold iron clinging to him like a second skin. His hand, heavy with the weight of gold rings that had bruised her skin more times than she could count, moved to grip her jaw with a deceptive, possessive gentleness. "You've been distracted lately, Nancy," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly threat that sent a shiver of pure ice down her spine. "Thinking about a world outside this cage. Or perhaps, thinking about the man who keeps watching us from the street." Nancy's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew he was talking about the shadows where Park Sung-min lurked, the invisible tether that was her only link to sanity. Shin's grip tightened, his thumb pressing into her cheek until the skin went white. The golden cage had officially run out of air. He wasn't just looking for a maid to control anymore. He was looking for a soul to extinguish. "I bought you to settle a debt," Shin snarled, his mask of calm finally shattering to reveal the monster beneath. "But dead weight is useless to me." He flung her toward the marble floor, the impact jarring her bones. As she scrambled to rise, she saw the glint of a blade, not a threat this time, but a promise. The cruelty had shifted from physical dominance to a lethal finality. Miles away, behind a bank of cold monitors, Park Sung-min's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of his desk. He watched the digital feed, the graininess of the night vision camera unable to hide the sheer terror in Nancy's wide, reflecting eyes. He heard her frantic breathing through his headset, a jagged sound that tore through his professional restraint. His moral code was a crumbling wall, and the obsession was the flood. He wasn't an agent anymore. He was a man watching his universe burn. He reached for his weapon, his breath hitching as Shin Tio raised the knife. This was no longer a mission of surveillance. It was a countdown to a murder, and the cold agent was finally reaching his breaking point. The penthouse smelled of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of old fear. Shin Tio stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the lights of Seoul shimmering behind him like cold diamonds. He didn't turn when Nancy entered the room. He didn't have to. To him, she was merely a fixture of the house, as silent and obedient as the silk drapes she cleaned. But tonight, the air in the room had shifted. The impulsive girl who had spilled wine at a wedding years ago was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned that in this world, mercy was a luxury she couldn't afford. "You're late with the tea," Tio remarked, his voice a low, jagged blade. He turned, his championship ring catching the light, the same ring that had left bruises on her jaw more times than she could count. He stepped toward her, his possessive hand reaching out to claim her face, his eyes dark with the casual cruelty that had defined their marriage. Nancy didn't flinch this time. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hand was steady, hidden beneath the folds of the white linen cloth she carried. As his fingers brushed her skin, Nancy didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, a final, lethal deception. "I'm done serving Shin," she whispered. The transition was instantaneous. The maid vanished and the executioner took her place. In one fluid motion, the silver blade she had taken from the kitchen slid from the linen. The silk of her uniform rustled as she lunged, driven by years of confinement and the memory of every tear shed under his roof. The steel found its mark, piercing through the expensive fabric of his suit. Tio's eyes widened, a look of pure shock replacing his arrogance as he realized his property had finally grown claws. He gasped, clutching at her, his weight pulling them both toward the floor. Blood, dark and hot, began to bloom across the cream-colored rug, blood on the silk. Nancy watched him fall, her face a mask of cold resolve. She felt no regret, only a staggering sense of weightlessness. Unbeknownst to her, blocks away in a darkened room, Park Sung-min sat before a wall of monitors. His breath hitched as he watched the grainy feed. He saw the flash of the knife and the collapse of the man he had spent years trying to dismantle. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of his desk. He should be calling for backup. He should be heading in to make an arrest. But as he watched Nancy stand over the body, his obsession flared into something transformative. He wasn't going to arrest her. He was going to protect her. The air in the penthouse was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the scent of expensive cologne. Nancy stood in the center of the wreckage, her white maid's uniform stained a deep, visceral crimson. On the Italian marble floor, Shin Teo lay still, his reign of terror ended by the very woman he thought he had broken. Her hands were shaking, the silver letter opener she'd used as a weapon slick and heavy. For the first time in years, the room was silent, but the silence was a vacuum, ready to swallow her whole the moment the siren started. Then the heavy oak doors slid open. Nancy didn't flinch, she was already dead inside. But it wasn't the triad guards or the police. It was Park Sung-min. He stepped over the threshold, his tailored overcoat casting a long, predatory shadow. He didn't look at the body of the most wanted man in Seoul. His eyes, cold and burning with that familiar, terrifying fixation, were locked onto Nancy. He took in her torn lace collar, the bruise blossoming on her cheek, and the raw defiance in her gaze. He didn't offer a hand or a word of comfort. Instead, he pulled a pair of black latex gloves from his pocket, the snap of the rubber echoing like a gunshot. "You should have called me sooner, Nancy," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. He moved with the clinical precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment in his darkest fantasies. While Nancy watched in a trance, the elite agent of the KNPA began to dismantle the truth. He retrieved the letter opener, wiping it clean with a chemical solution before placing it back on the desk. He moved to the security hub in the corner, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he purged the last hour of digital memory, ensuring the cameras saw only a ghost. He was erasing her crime, but in doing so, he was binding her to him forever. As he scrubbed a stray blood splatter from the mahogany wood, he was no longer a servant of the law. He was an accomplice to her survival. He finally turned back to her, standing inches away, the blue police lights from the street below flickering across his face. "From this moment, you were never here," he whispered, his hand hovering near her face but never touching, the ultimate display of his suffocating control. Shin Teo died at the hands of a rival syndicate. That is the only story the world will hear. Nancy looked at the man who had watched her suffer for years from behind a lens, the man who was now destroying his own soul to keep her in his sight. She realized then that she hadn't escaped a monster. She had simply traded a violent one for one whose obsession was far more permanent. The silence in the aftermath of Shin Teo's death was not peace. It was a ticking time bomb. As the news of the husband's disappearance rippled through the Seoul underworld, the air in the city grew heavy with the scent of ozone and old blood. Kang Jae-hoon sat in his high-rise office, the gold ring on his finger catching the cold moonlight. He didn't believe in accidents, and he certainly didn't believe in a maid vanishing into thin air without help. To him, Nancy Zola was a piece of property, a black diamond he had traded to secure his empire, and the sudden silence from Teo's estate felt like a personal insult to his authority. "Find her," Jae-hoon whispered, his voice a low, melodic threat that made his subordinates tremble, "and find out who cleaned the blood from the silk." He knew Nancy was resilient, but he suspected a traitor was shielding her, a shadow within the law. The hunt began at midnight. Black sedans tore through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul, their headlights cutting through the neon fog like predatory eyes. Nancy felt the noose tightening. She was no longer the impulsive girl who served wine at weddings. She was a woman living on the edge of a blade. Every siren in the distance felt like a heartbeat, and every flickering street lamp felt like a spotlight. She moved through the back alleys of Gangnam, her coat pulled tight, feeling the weight of the secrets she carried. Behind her, the obsession was closer than ever. Park Sung-min watched the mafia's movements through the KNPA's digital net, his jaw tight as he saw Jae-hoon's men closing in on Nancy's last known location. His career was already a ghost, sacrificed the moment he wiped the forensic evidence from her kitchen floor. Now, he wasn't just an agent. He was a wolf intercepting a pack. He watched her through a grainy CCTV feed, his thumb tracing her image on the screen. "Just a little longer, Nancy," he murmured to the empty room. He could see the black cars swarming the block where she hid. Jae-hoon was a man who burned down forests to find a single tree, and Nancy was the only fire he couldn't control. As the first door was kicked in and the shout of "Maid" echoed through the corridor, the hunt had reached its fever pitch. Nancy reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold steel of a burner phone, waiting for the one man who was both her captor and her only chance at survival. The rain over Seoul felt like liquid lead, cold and relentless, as Park Sung-min abandoned the last shred of his badge. He wasn't a director of the KNPA tonight. He was a man who had watched the woman he loved bleed through a surveillance lens for too many years. He stepped into Kang Jae-hoon's sprawling estate, the silhouette of his pistol a dark promise against the flickering neon of the city. Every alarm he bypassed was a bridge burned. Every guard he silenced was a step further into the abyss he had once sworn to police. Inside the mahogany-lined study, Kang Jae-hoon sat like a king on a crumbling throne, the gold watch on his wrist catching the dim light, the same gold that had bought Nancy's life. He didn't look surprised to see Sung-min. He looked amused. "You destroyed your career for a Maid, agent. You traded the law for a ghost," Jae-hoon sneered, his hand drifting toward the drawer of his desk. "I didn't trade it for a ghost." Sung-min's voice was a low, terrifying rasp, devoid of the icy control that had defined him for decades. "I traded it for the only thing that made me feel alive while I watched you try to kill her." Before Jae-hoon could draw, Sung-min moved with the lethal precision of a predator who had practiced this moment in his mind 1,000 times. The office exploded into a blur of motion, the crash of expensive crystal, the thunder of suppressed gunfire, and the heavy thud of a titan falling. Sung-min didn't feel the sting of the graze on his shoulder. He only felt the suffocating weight of his obsession finally finding its mark. He stood over the man who had sold Nancy, his breathing ragged. He wasn't a hero. He was the monster who had survived the hunt. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, a signal that his life as a lawman was officially over, he looked at his hands. They were stained, but for the first time in years they weren't trembling. He had gone rogue, not just to take out a boss, but to ensure that when he finally reached for Nancy, there would be no more shadows between them. The law was dead. Only the obsession remained. The air in the high-rise penthouse was thick with the metallic tang of spent casings, and the scent of expensive cologne turned sour by death. Kang Jae-hoon lay silent on the Italian marble, his influence evaporating with every passing second as the sirens of the KNPA wailed in the streets below. The empire hadn't just fallen. It had been dismantled from the inside by a woman they treated as furniture and an agent who had traded his soul for a shadow. Nancy stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her silhouette framed by the red and blue flicker of police lights. She was no longer the trembling girl sold into a blood treaty, nor the maid who scrubbed away the sins of powerful men. She was the one who had finally pulled the thread that unraveled it all. As she watched the authorities swarm the lobby far below, a heavy, familiar presence materialized in the doorway. Park Sung-min didn't look like a high-ranking director anymore. His tactical gear was torn, his face smeared with soot, and his eyes, those once disciplined, icy eyes, were entirely focused on her. He had officially crossed the Rubicon. By destroying the evidence of Nancy's final act against Shin Teo and orchestrating the raid that eliminated Jae-hoon, he had burned his badge along with the syndicate. The backup is 5 minutes out, Sung-min said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated in the quiet room. If we stay, I'm a hero and you're a witness. If we leave, we're both ghosts. Nancy turned to face him, the golden watch of her former captor still encircling her wrist, a trophy of the time she had stolen back. She looked at the man who had watched her suffer through a lens for years, the man whose obsession had been both her torment and her eventual salvation. There was no purity in what they had, no happily ever after written in the stars. It was a bond forged in the darkest corners of moral hypocrisy and shared trauma. I'm done being a witness to other people's lives, Nancy replied, her voice steady and sharp. She reached out, her hand hovering over the pistol at his hip before moving to grip his bloodied palm. And I'm done being watched. Sung-min's fingers closed around hers with a possessive, grounding strength. For the first time, he didn't need a camera to see her. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers as the world they both despised crumbled around them. Then let's disappear, he whispered. They didn't take the elevator. They moved through the service stairwells Nancy had navigated 1,000 times as a maid, slipping into the cold Seoul night just as the first tactical team breached the front doors. They didn't look back at the burning remains of the mafia empires or the hollowed-out laws of the city. As they merged into the anonymous flow of the rain-slicked streets, the black maid and the agent were gone, leaving behind only a legend of an obsession that was too fierce to be contained by the law. Nancy Zola wasn't saved by a hero. She was claimed by a man who was just as dangerous as the monsters she fled. Their love wasn't pure. It was forged in the fire of obsession and the blood of an empire. But in a world that tried to own her, Nancy finally chose her own destiny. If you felt the tension of Nancy and Sung-min's dark journey, show some love to the story. Hit that like button and comment, Revenge, if you want to see a sequel where they take down the rest of the syndicate. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notifications so you never miss a chapter of our Mafia Chronicles. See you in the next one.